Rabbi David Maayan is with us tonight, and it's a pleasure to meet you. We have not had the opportunity to learn together, certainly not on Zoom, so it's good to have you here with us. You are, of course, a graduate of Oberlin College. You studied comparative religion, Jewish mysticism, and then you went on to study in various, very diverse institutions. Naropa University, the Bat Ayin Yeshiva, a place close to my home yeshiva, Yeshivat Har Etzion, as well as the Mir, a lifelong teacher of Jewish texts. You were an instructor at the Modernity School in Brookline for a decade, and you lead a weekly class on Rabbi Nachman's lessons, which has met for 17 years now, since 2005, which means that you're probably around one piece of Likutei Moharan in at this point. You hold a master's degree from Hebrew College, and you're currently a PhD candidate in comparative theology at Boston College. You're a writer on the Pietzner and others. And I'll ask you right now, as you talk about Rabbi Nachman of Breslav, of course, a famous Ukrainian Jew of the 1700s, if you could speak to us for a moment. And I think about Rabbi Nachman as someone who had so much sorrow, so much terrible things happened in his life. His first wife passed away of tuberculosis. He himself died in his 30s. And there he is, kind of having this, at least the way we perceive him hundreds of years later, as this guy, this simcha guy. He's just always, and I don't know if that's really true in the moment, or that's something that he kind of put on to kind of teach others that this is what we should strive to be. But I ask you, Rabbi Maayan, if Rabbi Nachman is sitting with us today, instead of living during the time of the American Revolution, what would he be saying about world events right now? Welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you to Rabbi Dov Linzer and Rabbi Yonah Berman, to Yeshiva Chovavei Torah, and all of the partners for tonight's event. In terms of your question and your point about Simcha, I think in the case of Rabbi Nachman, the more closely one looks at Rabbi Nachman's teaching and goes beyond the bumper stickers about joy, which are valid as bumper stickers, the more that you see that Rabbi Nachman's teachings on joy come from a place of struggling with pain and with a kind of striving for a ruthless honesty and clarity that also has a cost of pain. So the joy is kind of brought in to try to balance that and as a partner to that. In terms of your question about, what Rabbi Nachman would say about what's happening today if he were alive now, besides the general answer, which is smart, which is that you can't speak on behalf of the dead and claim what they would say about contemporary events. But it is one thing I can say, though, that's interesting is it's brought in Breslav literature that Rabbi Nachman was very interested in current events. He would often ask his Hasidim and visitors for news of the day, for example, about the Napoleonic Wars, other political developments, and things that seemed like mundane news stories, basically. And sometimes the Hasidim or other people who visited were surprised that a Hasidic Rebbe was wasting time as they saw it. Why was he asking about these things? But somehow he would turn from these conversations, Torah or a story would emerge from that conversation. Often the links were very tenuous. So it's not like you can say, here's his op-ed, I understand what his position is on this. But somehow he was drawing Torah out of the contemporary world that he lived in and current events. He certainly saw world events and political developments as a kind of revelation. And part of the job of the Hasidic Rebbe is to find God in what was happening. I think that's the most we can say for sure about what he would be doing now. So I'm going to just share a few sources and so on in a PowerPoint. In fact, the first thing I just want to share, everyone can see? Yeah. The first thing I just want to share is a map. So this is a map taken from the excellent Historical Atlas of Hasidism, certainly a recommended recent title. And as you can see, it shows, this area, Ukraine and Eastern Europe in 1772. It happens to show that because that's just before the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You have the three partitions and the dissolution of it. 1772 was an important year in Hasidic history. It's the year that the Maggid of Mezrich died, and it's also the year that Rabbi Nachman of Breslav was born. However, if this was what this very basic political map of the area in 1772, by 5 years after Rabbi Nachman's death in 1810, so here's from 1815, the Congress of Vienna, the map has been radically redrawn. So the entire area, in fact, that Rabbi Nachman was active in was in contemporary Ukraine. If we look at this map that zooms in a little bit closer, and we won't spend too much time on this, but Rabbi Nachman was born in Mezhebozh, which of course is a town forever associated with the Baal Shem Tov, the legendary, sort of considered traditionally the founder of Hasidism, and also Rabbi Nachman's own great-grandfather. I won't read all the place names here, but Rabbi Nachman, his entire adult life is spent in this area of the Second Partition. So this is an area of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that became part of Tsarist Russia in 1793, when Rabbi Nachman was 21 years old. So virtually his entire life as a Rebbe. The Breslav oral tradition says that his first Chassid joined when he was already 13 years old, and that may well be true. But his full adult being a Tzaddik, being a Rebbe, took place entirely in this area that had recently become absorbed as part of Tsarist Russia. And certainly all of these places are part of contemporary Ukraine. He did travel beyond, most famously to Eretz Israel, sometimes also, for example, to what he would have called Lemberg, which is now Lviv, which is, of course, an important part and cultural center in contemporary Ukraine, and is also important in the context of the current war. So there's just a word about the political context before we look at something from Rabbi Nachman's Torah. So before the first partition, Russia had been officially closed to Jewish settlement, and there was no organized Jewish community there. But by the end of the third partition in 1795, Russia had gained about 600,000 Jews, the largest Jewish community in the world at the time. So obviously this raised a really fundamental political question. How is Russia going to relate to these new Jewish persons that are now in part of the empire? One fundamental aspect of that question was whether the Jews would be related to as an ethno-religious collective, and they would have a kind of collective autonomy, obviously limited autonomy, as they had before in the medieval model too, where there was a kahal structure, or whether Jews would be related to more as having individual autonomy as citizens. However, the latter often came with a presumption that there needed to be a serious level of assimilation. That's maybe even too gentle of a word for some of what people had in mind, truly the loss of one's Jewish identity in order to become a citizen. This question was happening all over Europe at different times in different ways throughout this period, but that's also what was happening in where Rabbi Nachman lived. So, sorry. There we go. So one thing I want to suggest is many scholars in recent decades have emphasized the fact that Hasidism is a modern movement and even a modernizing movement. That might sound paradoxical because most of us, our association of Hasidism is based on what happened around by the middle of the 19th century, when most Hasidic leaders and most Hasidic communities aligned themselves, usually very strongly, with the anti-modernizing forces that came to perceive themselves as the Orthodox. And that's true. However, the truth is that Hasidism from the beginning had a modernizing element. And specifically, the institution of the Hasidic Tzaddik, I think, has a modernizing aspect to it, or a modern aspect to it. I'm not saying that's not paradoxical, but it's partly true. So on the one hand, you could say, how can the Hasidic Tzaddik be a kind of archetype of a modern, more autonomous self? I mean, after all, just to put them on the table, the Hasidic Tzaddik would seem to be a pre-modern model. Many people would associate the Tzaddik with an authoritarian power structure, with superstition, and again, also anti-modern Hasidic ideology becomes associated with Hasidism, with Tzaddikim. So the Tzaddik is seen as a king. There are Hasidic courts with dynastic principles based on nobles and kings. A lot of times people go to tzaddikim for wonders and miraculous cures or prophetic advice rather than taking a more pragmatic or scientific approach or personally empowering approach from one point of view. Of course, there were some tzaddikim who engaged in a lot of wonder working and miracles, and others who absolutely did not. Although even those who did not often complained about how often people came to them wanting that. So it was certainly a part of the perception of the tzaddik. And finally, Hasidic ideology. However, if we look a little bit more subtly, we can see that the Hasidic tzaddik is often emphasized that the Hasidic tzaddik has a unique and original personality. There's an emphasis not only on them being sort of scoring high in traditional religious virtues, being very pious and so on, but on their absolute uniqueness, their originality. We sometimes have narratives of self-fashioning. So there's a narrative of self-becoming. Ultimately, in many Hasidic stories, tzaddikim are admired because they turn every religious act into an act of self-expression as well as devotion. Finally, there's also an emphasis on the autonomy of the tzaddik. So the tzaddik is seen as, again, original and self-generating to a certain extent. And therefore, there's even an emphasis on the power and autonomy and agency of the tzaddik, even to a certain extent, autonomy in relation to God, which we're going to be discussing a little bit more tonight. So first of all, a couple of example texts of how Rabbi Nachman emphasized his own originality. And in fact, he also saw this as being part of the nature of Hasidism itself. So we have here a text from his main disciple, Rabbi Nachman of Nimrov, Rabbi Nachman Sternhartz, where he says, well, Rabbi Nachman was speaking with me about the Baal Shem Tov, the Chidushei HaBaal Shem Tov, the innovations of the Baal Shem Tov, that he revealed new things in the world. The story of the Baal Shem Tov is something chadash, it's something new that had never been revealed, such a story before. Only in the writings of the Ari, of Rav Yitzchak Luria, is there anything in a few places, something like this. But still an emphasis on the originality and newness of the Baal Shem Tov. And notice also it's the newness of the story of the Baal Shem Tov. So it's somehow not just his teachings, but maybe something also about who he is and the story of who and what he was in the world. He also wasn't shy about speaking about his own originality. So at the bottom here, we have a quote where he said, if the Baal Shem Tov would hear my Torah, so it would be a big chiddush, it would be an innovation. The Baal Shem Tov would also be blown away, be impressed. If Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would hear my Torah, it would also be an innovation, even to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So he emphasized his own originality. We have actually also this kind of charming story where he's sitting with one of his followers, the Tirvitzer Magid, at Shabbos meal. And suddenly Reb Nachman sort of affectionately grabs the Tirvitzer Magid by the beard and he says to him, Chiddush kamoni adayin lo haya ba'olam. You know, an innovation, something new like me, there's never yet been in the world. So again, not shy about emphasizing his own uniqueness and greatness. Here we have a source where Rabbi Natan reflects on why is Rabbi Nachman doing this? Rabbi Nachman often would talk about his greatness and he would say, but you should know I worked very hard on this. It was a lot of work. So Rabbi Natan says, the reason that Rabbi Nachman told us these things is because he wanted us to envy his great achievements and then to become like him. So Rabbi Nachman was speaking about his unique greatness as an archetype and as an exemplar to drive others to also want to become like him. He boasted of his high level and deep perception, just like one taunts another and tries to make him jealous, and then to actually motivate him in the end to become like him. And Reb Nachman did use this language that the other person can become kamoni mamish, truly like me. He often even used the language that another person could become a guter yid kamoni mamish. A guter yid just means a good Jew, but actually it's a Hasidic phrase for a Hasidic Rebbe.
Okay.
So again, the claim that the Hasid can become the Rebbe. I made the claim before that the Tzaddik also has an aspect of autonomy. So Art Green discusses this, that basically this is already, there's a source in the Talmud that is very, very popular in Hasidic literature for this claim. The source is this from Moed Katan 16b, where in the verse, God speaks and he says, Moshel ba'adam tzaddik Moshel. The verse is enigmatic, difficult to translate. The interpretation in the Gemara is that God says, Ani Moshel ba'adam, I rule over people, but me Moshel bi, who rules over me? Tzaddik. The tzaddik rules over or overrules God. Shani gozer gezera umavatla. In the Vilna Shas, the way it's normally printed, it's this language. I make a decree and nullifies it. And however, I think the simple meaning is I make a decree and the tzaddik nullifies it. And in fact, in several manuscripts of the Talmud, the phrasing is Ani gozer gezera v'hu mevatla, which I think is the meaning. I make a decree, but he, the tzaddik, overrules me and nullifies my decree. So this is a rabbinic source. As you can see here, Art Green points out, this source is actually quoted by Levi Yitzchak Berdichev and Kedushas Levi more than any other rabbinic text. So it's not just something that's on the side, it's something that's in the center of a lot of discussion of tzaddik in Hasidic literature, which doesn't mean they discuss it the same way, but they discuss it and they use this source. So what I want to look at now with you in the closing several minutes here is this selection from Rabbi Nachman's main collection of teachings, Likutei Moharan. In this lesson, lesson number 34, he speaks at the beginning, lays this principle out. Here's the general rule, Hine haklal, shehamemshala b'yad hatzadik lif'ol pu'ulos kiritzono. The rulership is in the hands of the tzaddik to do acts or to enact things, to rule according to his will. As our rabbis interpreted, tzaddik moshel v'chule, right? That tzaddik rules over God. Mi moshel bi tzaddik. Who rules over me, says God? The tzaddik. He quotes this source. However, and then he goes on to discuss how the tzaddik is like this, the root soul, that's like the root of the tree, and all the souls of Israel are the branches that go out from that root soul. Certainly one would assume from this passage that he's describing something that applies to very few, very unique individuals. However, later on in the same lesson, he then says this in the beginning of section 4. Kol echad ve'echad miYisrael yesh bo bechinas tzaddik moshel. Every individual Jew, each and every Jew, has within him, I'm keeping the gender of the phrasing, the aspect of that tzaddik rules. After all, the verse says in Yeshayahu, your people are all tzaddikim, v'amei kulam tzaddikim. So every individual of Israel has this aspect of tzaddik moshel. That's also why the verse in Tehillim 114 says Yisrael mam shalosav, which Rabbi Nachman understands here as Israel, his rulers, meaning God's rulers. In other words, who rules over me? The tzaddik. Now he goes on to explain, what do I mean, So he says, why is this true that every individual of Israel has this aspect of the tzaddik who rules? Because every individual in Israel has a davar yakar, shebechinas nukuda, ma she'ein b'chaveiro. As I translate, every individual Jew has something precious, which is an aspect of a point, a nukuda, which is not in anyone else. Here you have very clearly laid out this emphasis on the absolute irreducible uniqueness of each individual. And he goes on to say, though, that uniqueness is an aspect of tzaddik, and specifically of the tzaddik who rules. This is an interesting emphasis I want to maintain. Reb Nosson, Rabbi Natan, as student, when he quotes this, he often says the aspect of tzaddik Moshe. But I've found in conversations, which I've had many conversations in my life with Breslovers about this lesson, they'll refer to it as Nekudat Tzaddik, the point of the tzaddik in each person. They won't say the point of the tzaddik Moshe. So what's that emphasis on the tzaddik's rulership? So I'm saying it's the tzaddik's autonomy. Now, in fact, he goes on to emphasize that. Look what he says here. He says, that Kodem Matan Torah, Haya hamemshala biyad Hashem yisbarach. Here he interprets what happened at the giving of the Torah. Before the giving of the Torah, the rulership was in the hands of God. V'achar matan Torah, nasan hamemshala liyad kol Yisrael, kol echad lefi bechinaso. But after the giving of the Torah, God gave the rulership into the hands of all of Israel, to each individual according to his aspect. So the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai is actually God's surrender of his rulership, of his dominion. How so? So he explains here that since the Torah encloses God's will, after all, the reason that the verses of the Torah say what they say and the mitzvot that are expressed there have the specific form that they have, and he gives the example, tefillin should be in this particular way, made of this particular material. So the reason that the Torah teaches that is because that's God's will. Okay. So it turns out, he says, that God's will is enclosed in the Torah. But if God then gives me the Torah, God is giving over God's will into my hands. That's how he says here, as what I put in bold. V'achshav shahatorah mesura biyadenu. But now that the Torah has been given over into our hands, gam haratzon shel Hashem yisbarach mesura biyadenu. So too also the will of God has been given over into our hands. Sha'anu moshlim kivyachol lios ritzono kefi ritzonenu. That now we have dominion or rule, as if you could say such a thing, so that God's will should be in accordance with our will. Finally, he goes on in this paragraph to say that this is also, this is based on the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says, well, here's this verse in Tehillim, God, you have done many great things. So they say, yes, the interpretation is God did many great things before the giving of the Torah. But after the giving of the Torah, God's wonders and thoughts are for us or upon us. Rabbi Nachman says, Hainu, in other words, it means to say, Shahakol biyadenu. It's been given into our hands. Now he says, this is the closing of the section, V'zeu anochi Hashem Elokecha hamalcha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am Hashem, your God, who raised you up out of the land of Egypt. So Rabbi Nachman interprets that, Hainu, in other words, Kodem matan Torah. Before the giving of the Torah, Haya hakol anochi. Everything was I. Meaning, the divine I, the divine self, expressed its agency when God took us out of Egypt. That was God's act, God's agency, God's self-expression. V'achar matan Torah, but after the giving of the Torah, open wide your mouth and I will fill it. You have to look at the Torah inside to get the fullness of what he means by that last part. But just to bring out the point, and to close, it seems at the end that he's saying that that even though we know the first word of the Aseret Dibrot is Anochi, is the divine I, for Rabbi Nachman, though, in this lesson, the secret of Matan Torah is it wasn't so much the revelation of the divine self and the divine I, as much as God's surrendering the divine I and giving us an I. Matan Torah is about giving us will and agency and selfhood by giving us the Torah. So this is what I wanted to look at with you. And there's more to say about it, but I think we're at the time. So thank you very much. And I appreciate to be able to share with you tonight.
Thank you. I'll ask you as a quick follow-up. So Eva Hutt asks one version of the question that I was thinking about, which is fascinating. Holy chutzpah, a bit dangerous, don't you think? And I'll say that slightly in different terms. And you can answer either way, Rabbi Maayan, which is, wow, what an opportunity, what responsibility we have now to maintain HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world. What does that what does that do? What do we do with that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the emphasis on responsibility, that's definitely true. That's something that goes back, of course, also to Kabbalah. So in the Kabbalah, where you have the emphasis on, for example, in Tikkun Zohar, where they say, Ein chavush matir atzmo mi beit ha'asurim, a prisoner can't free himself from prison. That's a famous quote from the beginning of Gemara Brachot. The Tikkun Zohar in a few places applies it to God. That God says, as it were, I can't free myself from prison. I need your help. So those are meant to bring out a sense of profound responsibility from the human being. And there's a sort of critique of the way that we can use religion in a way to absolve ourselves of responsibility. Of course, the opposite problem is what you might say is the looming danger in this lesson. I become completely power mad. I'm thrilled that God has, written himself out of the picture. Of course, that's not what Rabbi Nachman means, because you can look at everything else that he ever said.
That's kind of how we got into this mess to begin with that we're talking about tonight.
Well, that's right. I mean, when I'm saying Hasidism, when I'm saying Hasidism as an aspect of the modern self, obviously the only way you can say that is if you don't equate modernity with secularism or with atheism. I'm not claiming that Hasidism was atheist or secular. What I'm saying is that it's a modern form of religiosity, and that modernizing doesn't have to mean becoming less religious or less pious. So it's thinking about how this aspect of individuality and agency is affirmed within this still devotional imagination.
And before we move on to Rabbi Katz, I'll just point out that Dr. Mark Kaplan said something very profound, which is this idea that Rabbi Nachman sees tremendous power outside of the normal political realm. It's almost like you've got the political echelons going on, you've got the Napoleons of that time, you've got the whoever it is of this time, the Putins of this time, and yet there's this other layer of power that comes directly from Hakadosh Baruch Hu to us and to each of us individually. And he's speaking to simple, regular Jews who don't have any of that. And that's so beautiful and so profound and so powerful. So Rabbi Maayan, thank you for, pun intended, bringing from your wellspring to us tonight and allowing us to learn your Torah and to really get a sense of Rabbi Nachman's Torah, and a Torah that comes from a place which so needs that Torah right now. And it should be a scoop for all those who need that learning and need that Torah to be in their lives and to get them through this difficult time. So thank you so much for being with us tonight.